in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. The name Maundy comes from the Latin word mandatum, which means a commandment. This refers to Jesus' own commandment to love one another as He had loved us. St. John chapter 13 verses 34 and 35. This sets His own love as the standard. His own love as the standard by which we are to love one another. So for us to love one another, Jesus' love is the standard. And how did Jesus demonstrate this love? Jesus demonstrated this love for us by becoming the bread of life, the life-giving bread. Therefore, for this year's Maundy Thursday, we have the theme, Christ the life-giving bread. Now this theme, Christ the life-giving bread, it reminds us to translate Christ as the life-giving bread to our own situations. So based on today's 4 passages, Exodus chapter 12 verses 12 to 20, Psalm 116, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 23 to 29, and St. John chapter 6 verses 47 to 58. Based on these 4 passages, let us try to connect the life-giving love of Jesus to our own context. Firstly, in the context of domination. When we look at Exodus chapter 12 verses 12 to 20, we see the Lord instructing Moses and Aaron on how to remember His deliverance of Israel from Egyptian captivity. It entailed remembering the Lord's Passover, when He would pass over houses marked with the blood of a sacrificed lamb on the doorpost and spare that household's firstborn. But not only that, the Israelites, they were also commanded to get rid of all leaven before beginning the feast of the unleavened bread. Thus the Passover, the feast of Passover and the feast of unleavened bread were to be observed every year as a memorial of the Lord's deliverance from domination. So I would say, God's love meets us where we are. God's love meets us where we are. Not only that, His love liberates us from our oppressive settings. Secondly, in the context of dejection, Psalm 116. The psalmist in Psalm 116, he describes his ordeal with the bonds of death and his eventual release from them. The psalmist describes his dejection, which he refers to as his near-death experience, in verses 3 and 4. And then he leads, or this dejection, this feeling of near-death experience, his feeling of dejection, this actually leads him to reflect on the goodness and righteousness of the Lord in the following verses 5 and 6. Because of God's protection, the psalmist is able to live all his days in the presence of the Lord without passing out, without sobbing and without stumbling. Here, the Lord's vindication of the helpless is an illustration, is a real illustration of His divine benevolence, of His divine compassion. Therefore, God's love is closest to us when we are at our lowest, when we feel dejected. Thirdly, in the context of division or divisions, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 23 to 29. Here, St. Paul's portrayal of Jesus' final supper with His disciples reveals the enormous influence this reminiscence, this remembrance had on the early church. We see that in Matthew chapter 26 verses 26 to 29, Mark chapter 14 verses 22 to 25, and Luke chapter 22 verses 15 to 20. He passes on this memory to others, as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 23. For the purpose of his larger point, St. Paul's larger point, he does this in an effort to restore the worship services of a church that has been shattered by internal turmoil. The church at Corinth that was shattered by internal turmoil. So Paul exhorts us, not only the church at Corinth, also us who live in this generation, to let God's love, which is a reconciling love. God's love is a reconciling love. And He exhorts to us to let God's love, which is a reconciling love, be present in our community domains. Finally, St. John chapter 6 verses 47 to 58 speaks about or refers to a context of damnation. This reminds us that God's love goes beyond death and into eternal communion with Christ. The living bread that falls down from heaven, who is that? Jesus, is the only source of true nutrition and redemption. Jesus, the only true nutrition and redemption. The life Jesus provides, the life He provides is genuine but only received by faith. Jesus brings the same profound personal relationship with Himself as He was with the Father. In contrast to how the Jews of His day would have recognized manna as a miracle provision by God for the daily necessities in the wilderness, Jesus argues that His body as the bread of life, fills our bodily and spiritual hunger and saves us from eternal damnation. So to conclude, God's love encounters us in our context of domination, in our context of dejection, in our context of division or divisions, and in our context of damnation. Commanding us to have a love for one another, He has given us this example to be emulated. On this year's Maundy Thursday, let us heed His command or His commandment to love one another as He has loved us. Consequently, let us resolve to love one another regardless of our circumstances, lifting each other up, even as we lift each other out of domination, dejection, division, and damnation.